This is the Fantasy Football Podcast, where we take data and convert it into fantasy success. No bias, no hot takes, only victory. This is the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast, and now your host, Dustin Chandry. Welcome to episode 39 of the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. I'm your host, Dustin Chandry. For today's episode, we'll be doing a full recap with key observations and trends from around the league in Week 10. Now, before we get started, I want to talk about the fantasy fallout from two developing stories today. First, let's talk about the return of Justin Fields. Now, of course, Fields has not played since leaving midway through his Week 6 game. He will be returning to action in Week 11 against Detroit. Now, of course, Fields and the rest of the Bears, they looked miserable through the first 3 weeks of the season. However, Fields was excellent in Weeks 4 and 5. He finished as quarterback 3 and quarterback 1 in those 2 weeks. He averaged over 30 fantasy points a game in that 2-game sample prior to his injury. Now, with Fields returning, he should immediately return to your starting lineup this week against Detroit. As for the rest of the Bears' skill players, I think the return of Justin Fields is a downgrade for the entire running back unit. The running back unit on average scores 3.5 points less when Justin Fields plays. On top of that, the return of Khalil Herbert, I think, compounds things even more. You have less opportunity plus more fragmentation in that backfield. I would not start any Bears running back this week. However, I would move DJ Moore back into your starting lineup. From weeks 2 to 5, DJ Moore had 8 targets a game. He was dominating team target share and air yard share. He had 5 total touchdowns in that span, and he had 2 top 5 weekly finishes in the wide receiver position. Now, Moore's target volume has dropped slightly, but his air yardage has dropped sharply without Justin Fields. But with Fields back, DJ Moore can be moved back into your starting lineups. The other breaking development today is that the Cleveland Browns announced that quarterback Deshaun Watson will be out the remainder of the season with surgery to his throwing shoulder. Now, they did already announce that rookie Dorian Thompson-Robinson will start this week over P.J. Walker. Now, DTR, he had 1 start in Week 4. In that game, he finished with 3 fantasy points. Now, I think the big development is what this means for wide receiver Amari Cooper, because his splits with and without Watson this year is pretty stark. And it's not an issue of utilization with Amari Cooper. For example, his target share per game with Deshaun Watson is 24%. His target share per game without Deshaun Watson, it's actually a little bit higher at 25%. The issue is his success rate. If you look at his catch rate, with Deshaun Watson, he is catching 72% of his targets. Without Deshaun Watson, he's only catching 39% of his targets. Then, of course, that ties to the amount of receiving yards that you have. He's averaging 94 yards with Watson. He's averaging only 59 yards without Watson. And then, of course, he has 2 touchdowns this year. Both of those came when Deshaun Watson was at quarterback, as opposed to either Dorian Thompson-Robinson or P.J. Walker. In the end, when it comes to PPR points per game, Amari Cooper is averaging 17.6 points per game with Deshaun Watson at quarterback, and without him, he is only averaging 9.1. And of course, Watson now will be out the remainder of the season. Now, outside of running back Jerome Ford, I would not feel comfortable starting any Cleveland player in my lineup for Week 11. And in fact, I'd actually be looking to deal Cooper if I could. If I could package another flex-worthy player with Cooper, I would actually target the aforementioned DJ Moore, and I would do that deal in a heartbeat based on today's developments. Before we get started with Week 10 key observations and trends, I want to remind you, you can follow and interact with the show on Twitter. We are at FFAlchemistPod. Now verified, again, it is at FFAlchemistPod. You can also email the show any questions at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com. Over the last 3 games, the Baltimore Ravens have 11 offensive touchdowns. However, only 2 of those 11 touchdowns included Lamar Jackson, either passing or rushing. That's 18% of those 11 touchdowns. Last year, Lamar accounted for 74% of the team's touchdowns. And just based on last year's pace, Lamar should have had an additional 6 touchdowns over the last 3 games. The good news is that the Ravens offense is putting up a lot of points right now, and significant regression is coming for Lamar owners. Unfortunately, it might be too late for those who do own him in redraft leagues, making him an excellent trade target as we approach the trade deadline. Now on the flip side, you got running back Gus Edwards. He did it again on Sunday. He had another rushing touchdown, which actually saved his day as he only had 9.8 fantasy points, 6 of which came on the touchdown run. Now in total, that makes 7 touchdowns over his last 4 games. Edwards' previous career high was 6 touchdowns in 2020. Edwards has 8 touchdowns in total through 10 games this year, despite a sub 50% snap participation. Edwards' snap rate in the last 4 games, where he is averaging this crazy touchdown run, he has a snap participation of 50, 52, 18, and 52. And his total opportunities in those games are on average 13 total opportunities. That'd be rushes plus targets. On top of that, Gus Edwards has 118 fantasy points this year, but 40% of that production has come via the 8 rushing touchdowns. Massive regression is coming for Gus Edwards too. And looking at recent trades via Fantasy Calc, you should be able to get a solid return if you sell high right now. So to recap, buy Lamar, sell Gus Edwards. On Sunday, the Pittsburgh Steelers did a very Atlanta Falcon-y thing. They had 12 more carries than targets in Week 10. That was 34 carries to 22 targets. But what was interesting is that the running back unit accounted for over a third of the target share. There was 4 targets each for both Jaylen Warren and Najee Harris. Now there is some scuttle that Jaylen Warren is going to be named the starter. However, I don't put too much stock in that at the moment. I suspect this will remain a split backfield like it's been much of the season. Now, I kind of mentioned an Atlanta Falcon-y sort of game for the Pittsburgh Steelers. By comparison, the Falcons had 19 more carries than targets in Week 10. They had 38 carries to 19 targets. And of the 19 targets, the running back unit accounted for a third of those targets, 32%. That only left scraps for Drake London and Kyle Pitts, and just like we saw with Pittsburgh, that left scraps for the like of Deontay Johnson and George Pickens. Now for the Falcons, the positive note is that Bijan Robinson, who has been a frustrating asset since Week 7, he never really should have been out of your starting lineup, but last week he finally rewarded you with 24 total opportunities, tying his career high from Week 2. He finished with 17 fantasy points. So in summary, you have to keep Bijan in your starting lineup and London and Pitts out of it. And from the Pittsburgh side, I'd be very comfortable continuing to start both Jaylen Warren and Najee Harris as a late RB2 or flex option if you need it there. But I would be very cautious about starting Deontay Johnson, and I would absolutely not start George Pickens. Now let's talk about the return of Cardinals quarterback Kyler Murray. Of course, this was his first game back from a late season ACL tear last year, and I thought Murray looked pretty good. Surprisingly, he showed some pre-knee injury mobility both in and out of the pocket. He had 33 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. He scored 18 fantasy points, and I still think there's actually some more upside to be observed with Kyler Murray. His completion percentage on Sunday was lower than his career average, and over his career, he averages almost 2 touchdowns a game. He only had 1 rushing touchdown on Sunday, and yet was close to his career 20-point scoring average. I still think there is a lot of fantasy fruit to be realized with Kyler Murray for the rest of the season. Now, as for his targets, Trey McBride, the tight end, was one of my favorite start candidates for Week 10. He rewarded those who started him with 8 receptions on 9 targets, 131 yards. He has over 20 fantasy points in 2 of his last 3 games. And in Week 10 with Kyler Murray back, here's Trey McBride's stat line. He had a team-high 9 targets. That's a 31% target share. He had 32% target per route run rate, and he had a season-high 14.5 yards per target and 16.3 yards per catch. Now, I would rank Trey McBride as tight end 7 for the rest of the season. Jaguars quarterback Trevor Lawrence was drafted as a top 10 quarterback in redraft leagues before the season started, and he's currently ranked as Dynasty quarterback 8. However, he is currently quarterback 19 on the season. And worse yet, if you look at the percentage of games where Trevor Lawrence has finished inside the weekly top 10 of scoring at his position by year, here's what that looks like. In 2021, he was at 12%. 2022, he was at 47%. In 2023, he he has dropped down to 20%, meaning only 1 out of every 5 games this year, Trevor Lawrence has been inside the top 10 in weekly scoring. For his career, he is at 12 out of 44 games, 27% of his games, he has been inside the weekly top 10. And all of Lawrence's passing numbers compared to last year are very much on par. Attempts, yardage, completion percentage, all very similar. The culprit to his fantasy decline this year has been touchdowns. Last year, Lawrence had 30 total touchdowns, including 5 rushing touchdowns. He averaged 1.75 touchdowns per game last year. This year, Lawrence has 9 touchdowns through 9 games. All of them are passing touchdowns. He has no rushing touchdowns currently. He's averaging 1 touchdown a game after averaging 1.75 per game last year. And furthermore, Lawrence only has 2 multiple touchdown games this year, and both of those were only 2 touchdowns each. This is a guy who is due a massive contract extension this offseason, but through the first 3 years of his career, for fantasy purposes, Trevor Lawrence has been incredibly pedestrian. And while Trevor Lawrence has been a massive disappointment this year, one player you still might be able to go get on the waiver wire to replace him is Vikings quarterback Josh Dobbs. Dobbs has 3 straight games between 23 to 25 fantasy points. One of those were in Arizona, and of course the last 2 in Minnesota. He has 4 straight games with a rushing touchdown. And since week 6, Dobbs has consistently been between 6 to 8 rushing attempts a game. That gives him a high floor from a rushing standpoint. And Dobbs is averaging 9 fantasy points a game just from his rushing alone. And it is remarkable that Dobbs is continuing to support the likes of TJ Hawkinson, who not only has he not seen any drop-off, but he's actually seen a slight increase in his production with Dobbs at quarterback. On Sunday, TJ Hawkinson had a season-high 15 targets, season-high 134 yards receiving, with a touchdown for a season-best 35.9 fantasy points. Now, over his last 4 games, TJ Hawkinson is averaging 12 targets per game with a 73% catch rate. He's averaging almost 100 receiving yards per game, and he has 2 touchdowns in that 4-game span. TJ Hawkinson is averaging 25 points a game over his last 4, and he has scored over 100 fantasy points in the last month. Now, the last tight end to have a 4-game stretch with over 100 fantasy points was Mark Andrews in late 2021. Let's pivot and talk about the surging Las Vegas Raiders. Now, what's interesting is that Jakobi Meyers has been one of my favorite targets through the first half of the season, but with the change at quarterback to rookie Aiden O'Connell, there are some red flags. Now, of course, Jimmy Garoppolo has started 5 games this year. Brian Hoyer had 1 start. Aiden O'Connell had a start in week 4, and then he has started the last 2 here in weeks 9 and 10. If you look at the target share between Davante Adams and Jakobi Meyers, this is what this looks like. With Jimmy Garoppolo, Adams was at 30% target share, Meyers was at 26%, right? Both were dominating. With the 1 start from Brian Hoyer, Davante Adams had a 33% target share, Jakobi Meyers was at 31%, right? They're both getting a third of the targets. However, with Aiden O'Connell over a 3-week sample, Davante Adams still at his mark, 32%. Jakobi Meyers has dropped dramatically to 13%. I think Meyers has to be considered a bench stash right now until we see some development with O'Connell in the coming weeks. But the other major development is the return of Josh Jacobs being the workhorse RB1 for fantasy. Now, the 3 games this season where Josh Jacobs had his highest number of opportunities are the exact 3 games started by Aiden O'Connell. Jacobs' total opportunities have ranged between 26 and 29 in those 3 games, and the last 2 games were his highest rushing attempts of the season, and the week 4 game was Jacobs' highest target volume of the season when he had 11 targets. And not only is Jacobs getting more opportunities, but his yards per carry has also progressed as well here in recent weeks. In Jacobs' first 7 games, he only broke 3.5 yards per carry once. And since week 8, Jacobs has done it in all 3, and in his last 3 games, he is more in line with his average from 2020 and 2021. And speaking of running back developments, let's talk about the Lions backfield, because rookie Jahmyr Gibbs led the Lions backfield in week 10 despite the return of David Montgomery. Of course, it's the first time this year that Gibbs has had more snaps, more opportunities, both more rushing attempts and more targets, which obviously led to more fantasy points. Now, if you compare Jahmyr Gibbs to David Montgomery, snap share, Gibbs was at 58% compared to 38% for Montgomery. Rushing attempts, 50 to 43. Inside the 5-yard line, rushing attempts were split 50-50. Route participation was higher, 2-to-1 share for Gibbs. Targets, 16% to 0% for Montgomery. And then, of course, fantasy points, 26.2 points for Jahmyr Gibbs, and still 17.6 points for David Montgomery. And since returning from injury in Week 7, Jahmyr Gibbs is the RB1 overall in fantasy points per game right now at the running back position. Now, due to the split nature of this backfield, I would view both Gibbs and Montgomery as running back 2s in your lineup for the rest of the season, but I think both should be starting in standard leagues. Now, another running back you should have been targeting for a trade at least 2 weeks ago, and you still might have one last window this week to acquire him, is Javonte Williams of the Denver Broncos. Now, on Monday Night Football, had his best fantasy game of the year. And since Week 7, when he started playing more than 50% of snaps, Williams has scored double-digit fantasy points in all 3 of those contests, averaging 17.5 fantasy points per game in that stretch, and of course with the season-best 21-point outing on Monday night. Now, on top of that, Williams is averaging 25 opportunities a game since Week 7, even though his snap share is just a little over 50%. I think Javonte Williams should be locked in as a running back 2 for the remainder of the season. For the last few weeks, I have warned about Washington Commanders' skill position fragmentation. We had another game like this in Week 10 with high passing volume. There was 40 total targets, but high position fragmentation where you had 11 different players getting a target in Week 10. And the target by position group broke out like this. The wide receiver group had 19 targets among 6 players. Tight end group, 8 targets by 2 players. And the running back group, 13 targets from 3 players. And by the way, wide receiver Jahan Dotson, who had 26 total targets in weeks 7 through 9, that's 8.5 targets a game. In week 10, Dotson ran 44 routes. He had 2 targets, 0 catches. That is less than a 5% target per route run rate. And since 2021, there were 231 instances where a wide receiver ran at least 44 routes in a game, just like Jahan Dotson did in week 10. Of them, only 4 of the 231 had 2 or fewer targets, and only 1 of them had 0 catches. On average of the 231 instances, that group had 9.5 targets and 15.5 fantasy points, and of course Jahan Dotson laid a goose egg. And then we'll wrap up today's show with 3 quick hits. First, I want to mention the Cincinnati Bengals, because something unique happened here with the Bengals, because almost a third of their targets in week 10 went to the tight end position group. But 4 different tight ends had at least 1 target. Yet specifically Tanner Hudson, he had a target per route run rate of over 41%. He had 7 targets on 17 routes run. If one of those tight ends can consolidate the snap participation, then you could end up with a sneaky tight end 1 for the second half of the season. But this is more of a hold and monitor situation currently at the moment. No action needed there. I also briefly want to mention Christian Watson of the Green Bay Packers, because since week 5, when Watson started to play over 75% of snaps coming back from the injury, Watson has 29 total targets, or almost 6 targets per game. Of them, he has only caught 12. That's a 41% catch rate. Last year, Christian Watson had a catch rate of 62%. In addition, last season, Christian Watson caught 7 touchdowns on 66 targets. That's 11% of his receptions were touchdowns. This year, Watson is only at 3%, 1 touchdown on 33 targets. And then lastly, let's talk about CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys, because CeeDee Lamb is the first player in NFL history to catch 10 passes and gain over 150 receiving yards in 3 consecutive contests. Now, there's been a lot of discussion early in the season if CeeDee Lamb was a bust, or at least based on his value of where he was drafted, if he was truly the dynasty wide receiver 3. But I think over the last 3 weeks, he has pretty much put that to bed. If you look at his points per game, in weeks 1 through 5, he averaged 14.1 points. Through weeks 6 through 10, he has averaged 31.8 points. In week 8, he had 12 for 158, 2 touchdowns. Week 9, 11 for 191. In week 10, 11 for 151 and 1. Over the last 3 games, that is 34 catches, 500 yards, 3 touchdowns. CeeDee Lamb was always the wide receiver 3 in dynasty rankings, and with this 3-game performance, I think this is obviously going to provide consensus in the space that is where CeeDee Lamb should be ranked. So that will wrap up episode 39 of the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. We'll be back with another episode later this week as we'll look ahead with recommendations on players you should not be afraid to start heading into week 11. And then, of course, next week we will be back with a trio of episodes. So for Dustin Chandry, signing off here at the Fantasy Alchemist podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. You can follow the pod on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod or email us at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com.